Good morning. My name is Jennifer Ryan, and on behalf of the Alliance of Women in Workers' Compensation, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Today is titled Authentically Navigating Your Journey with DEI, will last approximately 1 hour and is a live interactive webinar being broadcasted today, Thursday, June 16th, 2022. Before we get started, I would like to thank our 2022 corporate sponsors for their support on hosting events such as this. They support us not because they want their logos up on a screen, but they support the cause, which is to affect positive change in the workers' compensation industry through networking, support, mentoring, and collaboration. The Alliance is inclusive of all professionals in workers' compensation, regardless of career stage, with the belief that we can all learn from and support each other. Please be sure to head to the AWWC website for all upcoming events. We are excited to be hosting webinars, collaboration sessions, as well as in-person events throughout 2022. Be sure to check back on our website for registration details. If you cannot make one of our live, virtual, or in-person events, don't worry. Webinars and our main board-led events will be recorded and on demand for our followers. Our theme this year is Acknowledge, Adjust, Advance. Each quarter, our webinars and events will be centered around each mini theme. This quarter, we are focused on topics around cultivating your journey. Be sure to join in these discussions as we facilitate both virtual and in-person events. Have you joined our book club yet? This year, we launched our 2022 book club with 6 books to choose from previous keynote speakers the Alliance had at our events in 2021. If you love reading books, be sure to head to the AWWC website to sign up to join the club. You still have Q3 and Q4 to join. Change is preceded by trust. It is through acceptance and inclusion that trust will be formed and positive impact will occur. The Alliance is committed to creating a safe space in the workers' compensation industry for women of diverse backgrounds and experiences through a shared culture that integrates various perspectives. This is who we are and who we will be. The time to do better and be better is now. The Alliance understands that diversity is a journey, that we will take time to make meaningful changes for our organization, its followers, and supporters. We will be intentional in making progress along our key pillars of change. Today, we will learn how our personal experiences and professional duties can intersect with getting involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Holly Noon will be sharing her personal and professional journey with DEI and recommend ways to get started in your own DEI journey. Holly Noon is a mother, HR, and DEI professional, content creator, millennial, and social justice advocate. She brings 12 plus years of experience related to human resources, DE&I, and social activism in her community. She attended the University of Central Florida, where she earned a bachelor's degree in legal studies and a master's degree in criminal justice. Also, Holly is an alumni of the University of Florida, where she earned a master's degree in management. Holly resides in South Florida with her 2 young daughters. In her spare time, she enjoys podcasting, outdoor activities, and volunteers in her community by offering workforce training to underserved and underrepresented groups through the Broward County Library System. Holly is also an author of the book, It's Not All About You, So Please Understand, the social textbook to understanding concepts related to racism and people of color. As this is a live interactive webinar, Holly will be asking you to participate through the Zoom chat feature on your screen. Please feel free to ask questions and she will answer as many as time permits. Thank you for the time you're spending with us today, and we hope you enjoy this webinar.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm Holly Noon, and I prefer the pronouns she, her. So let me get started by pulling up my PowerPoint I have for this. So to start with, we're going to talk about authentically navigating your journey with DEI. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what does that mean? And we want to be authentic about it. We don't want it to be performative. So I'm going to share my personal journey as to how I got involved with diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, strategies, um, got changed, made a career transition to it. Uh, so let's get started. So a big thing you talk about when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion is intersectionality and identity. Like, how do you identify, right? We take those self-identification surveys. And as we're taking the self-identification surveys, we're saying, okay, we're this, race, gender, we're describing who we are. But I think another important part when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion is the intersectionality of the different aspects of our human experience and what makes us who we are and shapes us. So for me, some places, how I identify or how I can relate to others is I have veteran family members. My father was in the military. I have a brother that serves in the military currently. I have a stepbrother that does, and I have many other people in my circle that are military veterans are currently serving. I have family members who have disabilities, both visible and invisible. I'm racially diverse. My mom is Filipino. My biological dad is African American. My adopted dad is white, and all my siblings are mixed race. I'm also a first generation American because I was born abroad. I was born in the Philippines, and I grew up in a home that had a second language. I'm a mom. I've also been a caregiver to a sick parent. And I also have really close friends who are part of the LGBTQ plus community. So when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we talk about individuals with disabilities, veterans, racially diverse, underrepresented groups. I'm a woman, so we talk about gender and what that looks like. So I think that's really important when we talk about how we want to get involved into DEI, and in recognizing like where do our experiences, how we identify intersect with other people and aspects. So I always like to share these photos because to explain to people my background and where I come from and how I got into DE&I. So growing up with a white dad who's in the far corner, he's holding me, and me being, for the most part, the only person of color in my family, that was a unique experience. So it was kind of, I had to explain to my family like things that I would go through, like if I experienced racism, microaggressions, and having to almost educate them, as well as them empathizing with me because there were just certain things they hadn't had experience, but they're also raising a child who is racially diverse. Also, these are in the middle of these photos are my two young daughters. I tried to do DE&I work because I want to make it better for them and their next generation. So it's very important to me that I get involved and take action and help other people get involved in this DEI journey. And then this is at the far corner, that's my mom, and then my two brothers. So, and then their dad is the one that's holding me at the end. So imagine just walking around and you see this really racially diverse family. My dad, who also served in the military, was also born in Germany. My other brother was born abroad, just like my mother. So for most of us, we are, first generation Americans, but also I think it really gave me a good foundation as I approached DE&I. So let me talk a little bit about my personal and professional journey, right? So when I grew up, I always volunteered. So, I talk about sharing my time, my resources, knowledge. So growing up, I always used to, in school, help the younger grades teach them how to read. I would always try to do community service. I volunteered for Special Olympics. So I was on a team. My dad coached, was one of the coaches of the Special Olympics team through the school that I was at. Um, Anytime I could participate in helping my community, I did. So volunteered at the library, reading to other children and being a volunteer. So I've always had a passion to give back to my community and take action. So it doesn't have to, at that point, I realize it's like DE&I, right? I think it's just me wanting to be helpful and be of service. It's kind of, for me, when I think of DEI, like the foundation, like that foundational layer of like wanting to educate yourself, wanting to share your resources and share your, time being one of them, and getting involved in your community. So as a professional, how I started this journey was, so I worked for Travelers, I've worked for Geico, I worked for in the construction industry for a general contractor, doing workers' comp. So for me, at all these organizations, the baby step for me to get involved in DEI at work was joining affinity groups or employee resource groups. And mind you, I didn't just join the ones that I connected with, whether it be like the Black network or the Asian network or ones just for women. Like I would join the LGBTQ plus. I would join, if they allowed me to join, I would join all of them basically, and I would network and understand like what are the issues that affect this group of people. How can I help? And so that's kind of how I started, like getting into DE&I was just participating in employee resource groups. If they needed someone to run an event, I would run it. If we didn't have any at all, I would try to help start one at our office location for where we were at, to create these spaces for people to meet and talk about certain issues that impact this group of people. So that's the way to start. Then when I became a manager, when I was a corporate claims manager, that's when I had a little bit of like a little more power, I could have a little more influence. And so that's when I started holding trainings and speaking with upper management about diversity, equity, inclusion strategies, right? Like, what does that mean? So, for example, like with workers' comp, it's not just like the employee being hurt, right? A lot of things would come out of that. For example, like, hey, my manager's not treating me very well. And then, a lot of things would just come out. But a lot of cases, it would be like, I don't feel like I'm being treated fairly. Here's why. This is how my manager is talking to me. And so it doesn't always have to be like someone being racially diverse. I think it also just has to be like recognizing that people need certain accommodations, whether, hey, I'm a parent, I need a certain schedule, or, hey, do you accommodate someone who's serving in the armed forces, or do you, because I may need to leave, can I have my job if I come back? Like, it's just those things that we need to recognize. And so we were having those kind of discussions. So that way, as I started in my journey, it just started being in a small group. But then as I got involved in management, really bringing those discussions to leadership to say, hey, I think this could be an issue down the line if we don't have these discussions, because it can impact these certain groups, and getting them to think about how we can have these discussions in safe spaces, and get people to feel comfortable talking to management about their issues. And then for me, just as a professional, during the pandemic, I wanted to make a full transition to doing DEI work. So while I was a manager and did workers' comp claims, I really just wanted to do DE&I work full time. So for like a year and a half, I would just apply to different DEI roles that I felt like accommodated my skill set, having an HR background, risk management, having worked with employees. And then also taking just my personal experience, right? So, like they said, I have a bachelor's in legal studies and a master's in criminal justice. So, definitely studied the issues that impact certain populations in terms of just sentencing, resources, um, socioeconomic issues. And so because of that, I really wanted to get involved in the issues that affect certain groups, because we do all come to work, and sometimes we aren't really able to show who we really are and kind of have to minimize certain things. And so I wanted to do that work full time, which I did. So I was able to transition, um, and work full time in a diversity, equity, and inclusion role. But mind you, that doesn't have to be everybody's journey in terms of like having to be like a full-time DEI professional. But if that's something you're interested in, like I said, employee resource groups, getting webinars, getting people to speak about DEI at your organization, even just narrowing down to certain topics like bias, microaggressions, talking about what does being inclusive mean, that's all beneficial and can be helpful. So when we talk about starting your DEI journey, right, what does that really mean? And so the tips that I'm going to share actually come from the book, It's Not About You, So Please Understand. So this book I have is available on Amazon, and it literally has a whole chapter on ways you can take action, books you can read, podcasts you can listen to, documentaries you can watch. And so this list that I'm going to share is, and it's broken down in the way of like personal involvement, corporate involvement, community involvement. We have those lists laid out in the book. So one way you can really start your DEI journey is define your values, like prioritize, like what matters to you. So like if you're someone who, for example, you have a disability and you want to advocate for others that do, that's kind of what we mean by defining your values, prioritizing, really getting involved, and might start with the issues that affect you. But remember, when you fight for that group, I mean, all those things help other groups. So when we also have to think beyond just diversity, because I think sometimes people get stuck on, oh, we gotta diversify, things gotta look a little different. For example, we need a more racially diverse organization, but we also have to think inclusive too. So don't get stuck on just being diverse, but we also need to think about inclusivity and like what that looks like. Again, acknowledging that there is a problem and that the work is necessary. So what I always say to that is, if you observe something that doesn't seem quite right in your organization or maybe in a community group, it's just kind of addressing it and saying, all right, man, we tend to have, for example, a lot of men in this group, but there's really no women. So maybe we need to think about what is our strategy going to be in recruiting more women or more millennials, or maybe people of other generations, make it more diverse age-wise. So that's kind of what we need to think about too. Another example is using your brand for impact. So for example, for me, I'm always trying to share things on LinkedIn that I find from other people sharing DE&I content, or if I like an organization and see what they're doing with DEI. So I just listed some of these organizations where, particularly after George Floyd, some of these organizations, were donating money, making sure they had racially diverse brands like on their shelves. So that's kind of what I mean, is that if you do have a following of some type or have some type of influence, kind of just seeing what you can do in terms of promoting the importance of DE&I. Also, again, checks and balances to make sure there are initiatives put in place. So, for example, it's like we can have a training about empathizing, microaggressions, and implicit bias. Great, we have those trainings. We can educate. But if the company doesn't have a plan or a strategy, I mean, it's like, where's that information and education going to go? So it's really important that if you're going to have the trainings, there are actions in place to follow up to make sure the work is actually being done. So, part two. And I think for me, this is kind of when we think about like what are the actual steps, right? Of like actually authentically navigating your DEI journey, right? Take initiative, right? So it's enough to be like, wow, I see something wrong and I see people talking about it on social media. And if you're not sure what's going on, I don't expect people to necessarily like, I'm gonna go out there and march with everyone, or I'm gonna go out there and donate money. That's not exactly, it could just be like, I see this as an issue. Let me do some education on this issue and make myself aware. Like, what am I missing? Like, why is this issue so important to this group of people? And for me, for example, like if I'm not a part of the LGBTQ plus community, but I would like to be an ally, I need to educate myself on the issues that affect that group of people. I need to make myself aware. So maybe I'm not using the wrong pronouns for somebody, or, oh, I didn't realize that legal case can really impact, your medical benefits. So that is a big deal because that doesn't impact me, but that impacts them. So I need to be aware of that. So that's when I say like take initiative, and the education and awareness. That's an example of that where, you know, I don't, I, it doesn't impact me directly always, but I can empathize because I understand. So please understand that's where the title comes from. I can empathize and say, yeah, that would really bother me or hurt me if I didn't have certain medical benefits because um, of gender or how I identify. So that's what I mean by that. Do seek out. So in terms of the professional, like do seek out support from your human resource team or Office of Diversity and Inclusion, however the organization is set up. I mean, sometimes when we're in the work, we don't realize, but feedback is necessary, right? And if you don't know or you don't know where to start, reaching out to people who might be in the space is always a good idea. And I know for me, when people reach out, like, how do I get started? What videos can I watch? Like, that is something that I try to always do. So, mind you, if I don't know something, I try to go to people who I know, whether that be professors in the area, people I see who I follow on social media to see, like, hey, what are they recommending to see if I need to go seek it out. Again, focus on initiatives that change root causes. So, what I say to this is, for example, when you hear people talking about like systemic issues, that's what we're talking about, changing root causes. Like, it's great, you can hire more people to make your management racially diverse, or hire more women, or hire more individuals with disability, veterans. You can do all that, but again, is the company focused on retention? Are they focused on changing the culture to retain the talent? Or are we just going to keep having the turnover because you're getting these individuals in the door to diversify your company, but you're not doing anything to retain them, and they leave because they are experiencing microaggressions, they're experiencing all these issues. So we always have to look at things very holistically. It's like you can recruit more here, but you got to also retain. And what does that look like? And so changing root causes as to like what are the issues and how can we really fix them? Because if it hasn't been working, we need to try something else. And so what does that look like? Again, get involved. It says here political processes, but again, it's more like who are the decision makers and what suggestions can you propose? I mean, I'm a big person when it comes to DE&I. I really am about solution, and I try to do things that can make a direct impact. And so for me, for example, in my community, like if I know there is a certain population that's struggling to find a job because they don't really know how to use a computer, they don't even really have like any computer skills, maybe not much of a education either, but I do, then I try to share my skill sets with them and help them. So I might help them create a resume. I might help them just get on the computer and how to search for jobs, because that's an impact that's going to make their life easier for them. And so that's what I try to do. So getting involved, sharing my resources. I tell people all the time when I've gone to like healing spaces and other groups where we talk about how can people get involved in DEI or eradicating racism and these things. And I think I always try to say like, what knowledge can you share? What resources, what time can you provide? I mean, there are people who literally just lack information and need people to get involved and help guide them in the right direction. So to me, getting involved, all these are action oriented verbs. So if you can, definitely get involved some way. So yes, now I will go to the chat and look for questions. Okay. So some of the questions are, what are some of my go-to resources outside of social media that you trust to take initiative to educate yourself and create better awareness? Sure. So I tend to be a part of several diversity, equity, inclusion groups that like so I'm part of book clubs. So one of those would be so I'm trying to think of because I'm a part of many book clubs, but I have a running list on Amazon of like anti-racism. So I have a list of authors, so I can definitely share that with people. But I kind of follow, so Ibram X. Kennedy, like How to Be Anti-Racist, like that's one. But also I follow certain Asian authors, Indigenous authors, professors. So I also, like any of the schools I've gone to, I've connected with professors. So those are the people also I lean on. So I have a professor, like if I have anything related to the Latinx community, I go to her. Any of my former African American studies professors, I go to them. But also, again, I follow, it's like thing outside of social media, but I follow things on social media that I find beneficial, meaning like activists, professors, political, not necessarily political commentators, but I'll say like commentators who focus on DEI. So, for example, we'll say like Camus Bell, like he has a book, an activity book coming out next month on how to be anti-racist. It's an activity book, but that's what I'm saying. I try to find people in the spaces where it's like, oh, I don't really know about Indigenous people. So I literally go on social media and find people who are like professors in the subject matter and then see what books they recommend. So I literally have a Amazon list where I see books and I just like add them so I can read them. Another person that is not big on social media is Dr. Brenna Greer. I interviewed her on my YouTube channel. She actually talked about the importance of Juneteenth. She has a book. She's a professor of culture, race, and gender studies. She's a really good person to pick when it comes to DE&I. So her and I've had extensive conversations, but she has a book out. She just recently did a presentation on Juneteenth, but her background is just talking about culture, race, sociology in general. So Dr. Brenna Greer is one person. Let's see here. So someone asked if my book is banned in some states. Honestly, I wouldn't know. It's not in the education system. It's actually meant more for human resource professionals, like in the corporate or professional space. It's available on Amazon. I've never actually submitted it to be considered a part of any type of curriculum. I just promote it as a resource guide. It's I don't know, you guys can see it, but it's very thin. It's not a long book at all. I want to say, let me look this different version. Yeah, the book I have is less than 100 pages. I want to say it's like 85 pages. So no, I mean, probably if I were to submit it, because it teaches things on systemic racism, lost cause narrative, it potentially could be. But again, it's out there for the public to consume on Amazon. Okay, so another question is, okay, do you have a recommended strategy for how to get diversity inclusion message through to all employees with a company, not those just signing up for ERG or expressing interest, those folks that need to hear the message? So, okay, so when it comes to recommending strategies on how to basically create a DEI message for the company, I think it's more than, right, you have like a cultural heritage month or the ERGs. I think it comes from what it has to be like a part of the company culture, meaning like, is it a part of an impact plan? Is it actually a part of initiatives? Does it equal to people's goals? Are metrics driven by diversity metrics? I think when we think about recommending like really DE&I, I think we have to really think about, if we are aware of people's differences and we acknowledge them, how does this make the workplace a better space? So for example, when I was a corporate claims manager, I did empathy training. And you're like, most people don't think, when you think of empathy, that is a very big part of diversity, equity, inclusion, being able to empathize with another person, even though you don't come from the same background, you don't identify the same racially or gender wise, but getting people to empathize was very hard, and not realizing like people being dismissive of people's feelings, writing people off, not taking people's complaints seriously, caused this big effect that affected like lawsuits, settlements, and all that down the line. So really getting a message that if we can promote diversity, equity, inclusion, that really does, which research has indicated, that it does help with profits when you have a more diversified culture, whether that's age, race, abilities. I think it's really important that when we talk about messaging, that we have to really talk about the benefits and like why it's necessary, and like having those selling points, like with a more diversified company, whether, and again, going to age, race, abilities, gender, this allows us to innovate more. So you have to sell those benefits when you're talking about messaging, to get people to buy in and get people to want to at least take initiative. But again, there's layers and steps, because it's like people can educate, but getting people to actually move to action is a different piece too. Okay, and then it looks like someone was referencing Anne. Does your company have a safety policy? Okay. Do you think DE&I should be taught at the elementary level? So Angela, I mean, I think it depends. So DE&I, so when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, I think from a professional standpoint, I think we understand it to be like, hey, we need more of this, to be more inclusive in this way, to be more equitable in these areas, right? From a professional standpoint. But when you think about it for kids, I mean, I think just exposing them to, hey, there are, so we talk about Black History Month, right? We talk about AAPI month, Pride month. I'm not saying they need to learn that way, but for example, my children, I have them read books, and the books teach them about individuals with disabilities. The books teach them about people who are racially diverse. So that in itself is DEI, right? Exposing them to people from different backgrounds, right? Oh, this person wasn't born here in America. They speak another language. So that's how DEI can work for young kids. It doesn't have to actually say, this is diversity, this is equity, and this is inclusion. We can start with just exposing them that there are people who have physical disabilities, mental disabilities. There are people who have served in the military, and this is what this means by to be a veteran. There are people from different racial backgrounds, and there are people from different countries. So these are their cultural traditions. So that's how I look at DEI when we talk about exposing young children, particularly at the elementary level. So in an environment where the company appears to foster diversity, how does one maintain when the majority employees are extremely vocal against any idea of it? Right. So I think to that point, I think we have to find where when a company appears to foster diversity, when is it being performative, where they're just saying, oh, we do this and we're hiring this, but then when you know on the back end, most people are against it. It's one of those things that you sometimes you have to like evaluate and say, like, holding people accountable. Now there's a way to do it, right? We're not talking like it has to be like a blow up or a conflict, but I think holding people accountable will, again, do people have metrics? Are people being measured by certain DEI stats, right? Like within 5 years, we want to hire so many racially diverse, more women, more individuals with disabilities in leadership roles, but no one's really working towards that. So I think holding people accountable, if you're in that spot or able to talk to a person who has that influence to say, I thought this is what the plan was and everyone's against it. So how do we get people to buy in to really, if this is what you want is to foster diversity, we need to like find the buy-in to get people to buy in. But I know it's difficult, like, right, easier said than done. But I will say that's why it's really important companies have some type of plan, goals to really be held accountable to, right? Even myself, it's like if we have, it's like saying, okay, well, I want to graduate with my PhD, but I don't really have any goals or outlines. I mean, you know, it's never going to get done. So we really have to hold people accountable. So do you have advice or suggestions on how managers, leaders can make their direct reports feel a sense of inclusion, belong? Yeah. So for this one, I love this question. Ask how they're doing. Now, when I ask that question, I say, it's not to say like, it's just to say, hey, how are you doing? How's life? And I used to teach that in empathy training because you would really find like, like, hey, good morning. Hey, how was your weekend? And I always felt like when I would ask my employees, like I would constantly check in with them. Hey, how was your weekend? Did you go do that thing? And I would just, as we continue to keep having conversations, they got more open with me. And then we just started to talk about personal life, things affecting them. And me just being like, hey, I know you told me this was happening. Are you okay? How can I support you? And that's how we can get to the inclusion, feeling like you belong. The equity piece, like feeling like, hey, we need to ask people how they're doing and checking in, and not just like, hey, good morning, how was your weekend? It was good. Okay, bye. Like, start slow and say, hey, how's your weekend? Hey, did you, find things that you have that you can find common ground in, and then move from there. I swear, people tell me a lot of things that sometimes I wish they didn't. But I really just say, I try to find things that we have in common, and then we move from there, and then people just tend to open up because I'm just listening. And I think because I'm listening and not interrupting them, and I'm really being intentional with how I'm listening, like nodding my head. Oh, so you said this. So just to confirm, I understand this is what you meant. And I think really being intentional that I'm invested and really trying to get to know them, that really does get people to open up. Okay, how do you balance merit-based decisions, hiring with DEI? So Jason, I see your question. So how do you balance merit-based decisions like example, hiring with DEI, right? I think it's not that it's like a new subject, new topic, but I think it is like, how do you balance where it's like, okay, you don't want to necessarily you don't want to create bias, right, in your hiring process, which would defeat the purpose of DEI, right? So what I'll say is this, is that you want to obviously hire the most qualified candidate. But what I say to that is, where are you sourcing your talent from, right? And also making sure the people that are sourcing the talent for you, or if you're doing it, making sure you're checking your own biases to make sure you're like, okay, I recognize that historically it's been white men in this position. So let me make sure when I do get candidates, I'm grabbing women, racially diverse, individuals with disabilities, like just being, not to say like you have to, but just being mindful that your bias doesn't affect the hiring process, as well as, you know, other people who are sourcing talent for you. I think that's one of the things that we struggle with, is always trying to figure out like, okay, the company says we need more Black people, we need to get at least to 5%, and this is going to affect, you know, our bonus or merit, like our merit or bonus in that way. But it's like, yeah, but you don't just want to hire someone and then you put them in a situation where it doesn't work out, right? We want to retain anybody that we hire. So it's just being mindful of our own biases. And so that's something that I always look at, like, where are people sourcing talent from, who's doing the recruiting, and then just kind of examining, like, if I look at my talent pool, like, is it really diverse in the sense of like, everyone comes from the same school, so it seems like we have a preference here. Oh, so those are just things I would consider. What do you say to people in your workplace who are vocally against DEI, especially if you're trying to be an ally? Oh, so when people are vocally against DE&I, I just, for the most part, I just ask them like, why? What are their reasons? And sometimes a lot of cases, people are just like, it's emotional. But I ask them what's their reason. And especially if you're trying to be an ally, for me personally, like, I've been in those spaces where you talk about DEI, people are like, oh my God, why do you guys talk about DEI? There's nothing wrong. Everybody's fine. Like, nothing needs to change. But I feel like you should continue to keep talking about it. And those that need it will feel the impact. And those that don't, I mean, they'll just be quiet or fall to the wayside. Now, I don't know if these people have power or not, but for me personally, whether it's personally or professionally, I don't ever stop my fight in DEI. So that's why I said I do DEI work in the organization that I work for and outside. So I'm tuned in. You know, I participate, like, I'm a part of a lot of organizations, like NAACP, the United Nations Association. I try to plug in everywhere so I can bring that information back to the organization to give me more ammunition on why DEI is important. Because in a lot of cases, when the people are against it, they really don't have a good reason. And in my mind, I'm saying, like, why wouldn't you want more diversity, more ideas, more ways to innovate? Why wouldn't you want inclusion? And mind you, DEI helps everybody. So you have to kind of question, when people are fighting it, is there a logical reason, or is it more of an emotional based reason? Are there any organizations that survey and reward corporate DEI culture? There are. But when I say that, there are. So and depending what field you're in, I currently work in the legal industry. So we have things like Mansfield, Working Mother, Inclusion Blueprint through like Diversity Lab. So there are organizations that survey and reward corporate DEI culture, but also just be mindful that just because an organization has a badge for DEI, sometimes a lot of these surveys also, you know, can just be checklists, but don't necessarily, in some cases, don't always really mirror what people are feeling, because some people, you might check off all the boxes, like, do you have a policy in this, or do you have this, or do you do this? We do those things, but you know, how does the actual organization feel? How do the employees feel? Do they feel it's actually valuable? So yes, there are organizations that survey and reward corporate DEI culture. But again, I think just always being mindful of like performative DEI versus like being intentional and actually actionable DEI, where you're making an impact and seeing change, versus just like checking off a list. Yeah, so that's really good that you have leadership that's committed to DEI and is diverse. So I think that's the thing, I think, is for organizations that aren't, like, how do you get there and what does that look like? And so that's why for me, I always try to say, like, making yourself aware and educating yourself on the issues that affect different groups. And then also what I'll say is, when it comes to DEI, there are some great free resources. So the University of South Florida had a workplace certificate in DE&I, which like thousands of people took, but they also have other certificates like inclusive leadership that are free. But if you want like the actual certificate, I think it's like $99. So I feel like it's one of the cheaper ones that I tend to recommend to people who want to just get interested in DEI. It's a few courses, but it's got great TED Talks. Some of the people involved are from Microsoft, Google. I mean, some very large corporations talking about DEI strategies. So I definitely use them. Yeah, so someone's talking about HRC. Yep, was just updated this year. Yep, I'm working on HRC as well, going through our policies and making sure we're updating them to make sure. But yeah, and I think that's a good point, because sometimes we, like, again, we don't want to be like, we have a policy, but how we actually looked at it to see how it impacts people is very important. So USF has one, the Cornell University, eCornell, like online, they have a diversity, equity, inclusion certificate. But for me, I try to also, from a historical standpoint, I do try to read books from the Indigenous perspective, Hispanic perspective, Asian individuals with disability, like just understanding the historical context of things and to see where we are now. And it also puts in perspective to me, like, why certain people fight for what they fight for. So that also for me helps put things in perspective when it comes to DE&I, like historically. That's why they have that term, like historically underrepresented groups, like women, people from different races, because I think it is important to acknowledge that there's a history here, and how do we address those root causes to make impact and lasting change. So that would be something to consider too, is like always just reading history books or watching documentaries to get the historical context to certain reasons people are social activists in certain areas or on certain subjects. So that would be that. But that is the presentation. Are there any more questions? And it looks like Jennifer dropped in the chat my book. You can follow me on social media. And again, if you have like any questions, I'd be glad to email you. You can email me and I'll answer them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Holly, for this conversation today. And thank you to all of our followers. Just as a reminder, this webinar will be on demand and it will be out on the website most likely by the end of the day tomorrow. And I just posted Holly's information where you can follow her on our social media platforms. Holly, thank you again for joining us today, and everyone have a great rest of the afternoon.